Okay, there we go. All right. Hello all, and welcome to the third talk in the OCHS Virtual Winter Speaker Series. My name is Ben Falter, and I am the Director of Education at the Ontario County Historical Society in Canandaigua, New York. Before I turn things over to our wonderful presenter, I have a couple of quick announcements. First, this speaker series highlights cloth and textiles to coincide with our current exhibit, Fibers of Our Lives. If you have not already visited the exhibit, it will be closing in late April 2023, so just a couple months from now, to make way for our next annual exhibit. So, if you're in the Canandaigua area, consider coming by OCHS to check it out before it leaves. Information about the Historical Society can be found on our website, and you should be able to find the link to our website in the description of this talk. There is only one more talk in this virtual speaker series after this one. So if you have not already registered to attend, I would recommend going to our website and grabbing a ticket. The last talk will be on March 16th at 7 p.m. and will be presented by Hallie Bond. You can find more information about that final talk in this series on our website. I'd also, as always, like to thank our exhibit sponsors, Canandaigua National Bank, Cats in the Kitchen, and Lazy Acre Alpacas for their continued support of the Historical Society and everything we do. And of course, thank you all for tuning in once again this evening. If you have any questions or comments during the talk, you may type them in the live chat, and I will pass them on to our speaker at the end during the Q&A period. But speaking of our speaker, allow me to introduce Brandon Brooks. Brandon is the curator of the John L. Whaley Gallery at the Genesee Country Village and Museum. Genesee Country Village and Museum is New York State's largest living history. And we are back. We're back. Sorry about that, folks. So Genesee Country Village and Museum preserves the architecture of the Genesee Valley region and presents context for telling New York State in 19th century American history. The John L. Whaley Gallery is part of GCVM established by the museum's founder and namesake for the gallery, John Whaley. The gallery highlights art, wildlife, clothing, and more connected to sporting and that culture from the 17th to 20th centuries. The gallery is also home to the Susan Green Costume Collection, featuring historic clothing from upstate New York with 3,500 plus items across 3 centuries. So, obviously, a lot of stuff going on at Genesee Country Village and Museum. If you want to learn more about them, as always, you can find a link to Genesee Country Village in the description of this talk. But I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Brandon. So go ahead and take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Ben, for that amazing introduction. Again, my name is Brandon Brooks, and I'm the curator of the John L. Whaley Gallery at Genesee Country Village and Museum. Ben did go into a bit of some of the collections that we have on site in the gallery. We have over 400 years of American and European sporting art and hunting art and wildlife art. And due to Susan Green's collecting prowess since the bicentennial, we are the very lucky possessors of the Susan Green collection, acquired from her in 2010, which, as Ben states, includes over 3,500, I'd say about 3,700 now, due to Susan's continued collecting and contributions to this amazing textile collection for men, women, and children across 19th century America. And we are going to the PowerPoint and presentation we have this evening is going to highlight some of the more fascinated and, in this case, gender-related clothing items from that collection. So without further ado, we will begin our presentation. Manifest Identity, Fashion Collections as Receptacles of Gender. So actually, I'll have us look first at this image right on the title page. It is an 1860. Oh, yes. No, I'm sorry that I am technologically inept. So let me start this over. How does that look? Excellent. Okay, so take two, manifest identity, fashion collections as receptacles of gender. So we are looking specifically at the Susan Green collection. And as we'll see as we go through this presentation, some of the amazing collection pieces from museums, libraries, institutions around the Rochester area, including Ontario County Historical Society. So beginning right with the object on our left, this pink, salmon pink silk taffeta ball gown, I'd say from 63 to maybe 65, 68 at the latest, 1863 to 1865. She will be featured in our upcoming spring 2023 exhibit, Becoming Gendered, Garment as Gender Artifacts. So this exhibit will examine how 19th century Americans conceptualized, inhabited, and really performed gender through their visual appearance. So many different factors play into how we present ourselves visually to the world, our internal identities, including gender being one of those factors. In the clothing, manifesting these internal identities to the external world around us. So some of the elements to create this image that we are getting in the image on the left are the structures and the scaffolding that really help create that shape for the ideal woman of the 1860s, the ideal fashionable woman of the 1860s. So we can see she has her stockings, and you can just see her drawers covering her lower limbs, her legs. We have the spring steel crinoline cage and one heavily tucked petticoat on top of that. I would note that she'd probably be wearing a couple more petticoats than just one. However, in this visual presentation, it would be difficult to provide our guests with a visually comprehensive and understandable presentation if there were many, many petticoats on top. So let's begin. So many of the factors that play into the fashion we wear, the way we present our gender, are presented here. So some of the available technology of the 19th century changes dramatically, whether we are making our clothing at home ourselves and adapting that clothing to changing styles, rather than toward the end of the century when a lot of clothing, especially for men, is mass produced and we can simply go to the store and buy another suit off the rack, literally and figuratively, and not really invest and cherish the fabric the way early 19th century Americans may have. Your class, how much money you have, your resources, that plays in to the way you're able to participate in fashion in the 19th century and today. I will also say that this isn't to say that people who were working class or maybe in a state of poverty in the 19th century weren't able to participate in gender. If you lack the means to buy an haute couture gown, you will find a way to live up to that fashion ideal based upon your limited means. Our social customs and the gender differences gender differentiations that we have created in society and our societal structure, with the moral elements we have attached to those values and social roles, that heavily plays into how we are going to visually manifest our internal gender identity. These fashion choices, the way we our gender, our roles of gender, and the way we think about men and women and their roles of society are directly affecting the clothing that is made for these people, and that clothing affects how you can literally and figuratively move within society. So As we're going to see, menswear in the 19th century, uh, practicality heavily plays into that, where you have this bifurcated garment, trousers, instead of miles and yards of fabric trailing and training behind you, or crinoline cages making it difficult for you to walk through a doorway, let alone get up early and take an omnibus to your job in the business district. We're also going to talk about how gender plays into fashion and who is seen and who is doing the seeing, who is ornamental and who is the one looking and assessing these individuals. So we're going to talk a lot tonight about this idea of separate spheres, and separate spheres translating into separate wardrobes. The 19th century, especially in America, this is the century where a line is being drawn in the sand, and this idea of men and women being innately different from one another really takes root, and that manifests in many different ways, including clothing. So this is the century where men and women really start to look differently from one another, and we think of men and women as men and women having this sort of moral, if not obligation, moral responsibility to look different from one another. This is also the century when we are getting the invention of the concept of childhood. So in earlier centuries, as we'll see, children were almost thought of as diminutive adults, and they were dressed very much in adult clothing, just shrunk down for a child's body size. In the 19th century, that changes. We start to get the introduction of psychology, the introduction of sciences, and the study of human nature. And we're getting all of this from the earlier 18th century foundation of the Enlightenment. So we are starting to think of children as almost like tabula rasa, this blank slate that we have to shape and mold, and they're innocent and precious at this time period. And we create a special wardrobe for children from this conceptualization of childhood. We're also going to talk about today the multiple women's dress movements that take place over the 19th century, from the dress movements of the dress reform movement, the dress movements around women's fashion and the women's rights reform, as well as later in the century, the rational dress movement. We're also going to talk about non-binary and androgynous fashions and how that is directly affected by or influenced by one's relationship with God in the 19th century, specifically with Public Universal Friend, who was a Quaker in this part of New York. And then we're going to talk about 19th century cross-dressing for pleasure, performance, and a little bit of power as well. So some of the terminology, I'd like to go through the terminology we'll use today. So we're defining gender as a range of characteristics pertaining to our conceptualization of femininity and masculinity, and really the differentiation between them. Now, we tend to, in the 19th century, and I'd say like maybe up until the 1980s, we thought of in the Western world as sex and gender being one and the same. Whereas now a lot of biologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and medical and research professionals are making a differentiation between gender and sex, where sex is seen as a biological element of humanity. It deals with your genetics and the organs that you have in and on the outside of your body, whereas gender is now thought of as an identity that you have internally and directly affects the way that you move throughout society, are viewed and perceived in society, and physically manifest in society, in this case with fashion. So one easy way to remember this that I hear often is sex, biological sex is what is between our legs, whereas gender is what is between our ears. So I'm also going to be using self-identifying language in this presentation. So what I mean by that is when we talk about certain individuals from the 19th century, I'm going to use the gender term, the name that they wanted to be referred to as. I will also say a caveat to this is that the fashion we're looking at today and really in this exhibit is limited to Western fashions of North America. We do have some Haudenosaunee ensembles in this exhibit, and we also have some examples of what Americans of color and Black Americans were wearing and subscribing to after the Civil War. But I will say that most of the fashion we have here today is from white Americans of the 19th century, from the upper to middle class America. Part of our collection mission beyond this exhibit at Genesee Country Village Museum is collecting more objects that represent a larger, more expansive, more accurate historic story and truth of all groups that lived here in this part of upstate New York. And gender is a macrocosm. It's a universe in and of itself. Our understanding of gender and sex and sexuality is dynamic. It changes within a decade's time. So I'm sure that not only will this presentation not be able to, or this exhibit will not be able to grasp the entire spectrum of gender, but 10 years from now, we might be thinking of it completely differently. So in the 19th century, we retrospectively look back at the 19th century, and in America, there is what is referred to as this cult of domesticity. So coming into the 19th century from the 18th century, from this age of enlightenment, this age of revolutions and the formation of this democratic America, we are seeing a new mode of romantic relationships and marriages form within Western society, where man and wife are seen more equal to each other than they may have been seen in the 18th century. And there is this emphasis placed on the domestic home and the family unit as being the bedrock of society. And we start to see the sort of an explanation as to why men are naturally best suited for the outside world and women have these natural innate qualities that make the domestic sphere more suitable to them. And that becomes separate spheres. So women are seen as more of they have this like natural moral superiority to men, which that quality lends itself to being a homemaker, creating this nurturing, morally upright home for their children to be raised in and to welcome their husband home. Whereas the man's role is outside in this dangerous, violent, vulgar public world of business. And he is welcomed again back home into this nurturing, morally upright environment by his wife, who is seen as sort of this angel of the home. And that directly affects what kind of clothing they're wearing. So women, if you are home and you aren't outside in this world traveling, you're not in the working class, you're in middle class, you can very much afford to live up to this ideal form of womanhood. And as you'll see in the exhibit, as it once it opens, there are many conflicting, changing ideas of what is a real woman, what is true womanhood, what is real womanhood, what is new womanhood that emerges across this 19th century. So in this separate spheres philosophy, there's this sort of oppositional equality that is reached between men and women, where they're both superior to one another in opposing qualities that complement one another. So there are separate spheres, there are separate wardrobes. Um, these gender cues, I would say, are mostly visual as well as behavioral. They can even affect the way that we speak and talk, certainly how we are portrayed within society and within our clothing. And we, just like today, a lot of these social roles and expectations, they change, but they change very gradually, to the point where we often experience them as sort of timeless truths about men and women. But if you look back over 100 years, these concepts and these truths are completely different, which in my mind implies that the roles that we create for men and women, many of the differences we think are innate amongst men and women may be more created and invented than we may be aware. And certainly the clothing itself is kind of an irrefutable it's irrefutable proof of that, especially when we're looking at menswear from the 18th century with its miles of lace, their powdered periwigs, their makeup use, the red high heels. 100 years later, all of that is now the purview of women, and a real 19th century man would not be caught dead wearing something like that. And women's wear becomes increasingly complex. It changes every single decade in the 19th century, and women really become more and more ornamental in the fashion world as the century progresses. So let's look at some fashion plates. These come to us from the Susan Green collection. Susan Green, along with clothing and textiles, has been collecting fashion plates since the 1970s. So we can see all the way in the top left, this is a gentleman from the 1790s. He's wearing a bright green silk tailcoat. He has makeup on his cheeks, powdered face, powdered huge wig, breeches, most likely of a white cashmere or maybe even silk. And I believe he has a colorful cockade on his newfangled top hat. And as we move across the century, we see menswear becoming more and more austere. There's an elegance to it, to be sure, but there is a movement away from decoration, from bright color, certainly from powdered wigs and makeup. And there's a movement away from unnecessary frivolities, which would have been, any sort of decorative detail in clothing could potentially be considered a frivolity. Menswear, this is the century where the suit as we know it today really takes hold of the Western world. To be sure, the three-piece suit predates the 19th century, but what we know today, where it's sort of this sea of black, navy, maybe brown or gray wool that makes up our suits with a white shirt. Maybe you can get away with a colorful tie. That's really where color is regulated for menswear as we move into this almost like a perpetual state of mourning for menswear in the 19th century. And as I mentioned earlier, these suits are very mass produced by the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, where you can go to a store, buy it in a size off the rack, and it is suitable for business. It's suitable for funerals, baptisms, or christenings, or in weddings. Menswear becomes increasingly more practical and useful as the century progresses. Now, women's wear becomes increasingly complex. As we can see here through these Susan Green fashion plates, the silhouette changes every decade, if not once or twice within each decade itself. And women who subscribe to fashionable dress become increasingly ornamental as the century progresses, with all sorts of appliances, scaffolding, understructures to achieve these rapidly changing silhouettes across the century. Now, this also becomes increasingly expensive and increasingly less able to be mass produced. So for instance, if we are creating an 1890s, the very last image on the bottom right, an 1890s day dress, for instance, the sleeve puffs, the tailoring of the waist, of the bodice into the waist, the flare of the skirt, the length of the skirt, these are all elements that really require not only money to pay for them, but some bespoke tailoring. You can't really mass produce such a highly specified dress to fit many different women's bodies. It's not really until really the 1920s when women are a column. The fashion ideal is a column with a drop waist. That clothing is able to be mass produced for fashionable dress is able to be mass produced for women of many different body types. You can fit a lot of people with a column versus a highly specialized 19th century dress shape for women. So this exhibit, as well as this presentation, has a lot of child's wear, and child's wear has a very fascinating gendered history in the 19th century. So I mentioned before how this is a century where we start to look at children differently. So we start to see them as like a blank slate, tabula rasa, this precious innocent little being that we mold and we educate and we raise and rear them into adulthood. So these concepts directly affect the way we clothe our children in the 19th century as well. There is this tradition of frocking both male and female children in the early 19th century. So essentially what a frock is it's a dress or a frock. Some people just call them frocks. So I will use the term frock. And they have a straight infant waist, and they tend to follow the fashion trends of adult women's dress, both for little boys and little girls when they are both in this this frocking age. And these frocks are often paired with little panelettes. So if we look at the image in the center, this little boy who is in a tartan frock, and I would almost say the frock. Yep. Oh, absolutely.
Hi, folks. Sorry, I've got a bit of a technical issue. I don't know if anyone can hear me right now, but I'm just going to see if I can fix the issue, and we will rejoin you very shortly.
Excellent.
Hi, folks. So sorry about that. Issue seems to have resolved itself. I will turn things back over to Brandon.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So we were looking at the little frocked boy in the center portrait, and he's wearing a tartan frock with white panelettes, and the child next to him to our left. I also think that maybe a little boy frocked with pantalettes beneath, and he has two elder sisters on the other side, both in actual dresses, but you can just see the panelettes coming out from underneath. Now, frocking for little boys continues across the 19th century. When they reach the age of about 8 or 9, they are taken out of their frocks and put into a bifurcated garment, trousers, for the rest of their life. They call this event the breeching. And again, it's around the age 8, maybe as late as 10. Little boys are thought of at this age as entering the age of reason. So they get their first big boy haircut at this time. They get their curls cut off, and the parental supervision and rearing of the child usually transfers from the mother to the father at this age. There is a short period where little boys are dressed in what was called a skeleton suit. Instead of the frock. This is from like 1780 to 1830s. Some people are still frocking their boys throughout this period anyway. But the skeleton suit, you can kind of think of it as like a romper or a onesie. It's a one-piece garment. Sometimes they're two pieces and buttoned together, but it looks like a one-piece garment. And this is really the first piece of clothing in the Western world that is made and designed just for little boys. And the image we have on our left has 3 brothers, and they're all in these little navy blue skeleton suits. Now we do have a few other children here. We have on the left an image of 3 children. Now the boy reclining in the back in the cream golden waistcoat, he's reached the age of breeching, so he's not in a frock anymore, and he is actually old enough now to be in his first grown-up suit. So you can't really see his feet behind the 2 other children, but he most likely has full-length trousers on, a jacket, a waistcoat, and a dress shirt. The boy all the way on the right of that first image is wearing a skeleton suit, and the child in the middle is frocked. I'm not sure if it is a boy or a girl. We cannot see the parting of their hair, but they may very well be a boy or a girl. Now, the image on the right is a little boy in a blue frock and panelettes, and you can see very much that this frock follows the fashion of an adult woman of the 1830s with the large sleeves, the very low arm side, and the neckline that goes across, a very deep neckline. Now, I mentioned how we could tell whether they're a boy or a girl based upon the hair. And I'm going to bring us to these images here. Little girls and adult women almost invariably part their hair in the center in the 19th century. So we get to the 80s and the 90s, that changes for men and women a little bit. There's a little bit of cross-gendering of the hair. But by and large, I would say men tend to part their hair on the side, whereas young girls and adult women are parting their hair right in the center. So we can tell this image on the left. The child on the left is a little boy, whereas the child on the right with their hair parted is a little girl. And then you see like a mysterious adult hand on that one side, probably trying to tell them to be still while the photograph is being taken. And then the image on the right, we see a little boy on the left, side parted, little girl center parted, a disgruntled little girl with her center parted hair, and then yet another little boy with his side parted hair. And it looks like the boy all the way on the left is still frocked. He has a little jacket on with maybe a skirt below him. Now, girls, they essentially stay frocked their whole life. So if we think of children as immature and wearing frocks, that idea of women just remaining in that state their whole life, there's a lot of implications in that, especially when we think about it through the lens of 19th century and these separate spheres where women and men supposedly have innate qualities that lend themselves to different activities. So what really changes for women, for young girls as they age, is the length of that frock will drop. There's usually a time when they get their first adult women, like a big girl dress, where they have a dropped hem, a lowered neckline rather than a more covered, higher neckline. There's also this fad with infant waists where it goes straight across the waist. So an adult woman may say, my daughter is she really wants her first adult dress, but I don't want her to, go into the tumult of adult womanhood so quickly. So I'm going to give her a dress with a drop hem and maybe even a drop neckline, but I'm going to make sure it still has that infant waist. So there's some semblance of innocence left for my child. There's also a time when girls are putting up their hair. So you can read Little Women or even Anne of Green Gables, and they talk about how excited they are to finally put up their hair and what style are they going to do as their first updo adult women's hairstyle. So then, in contrast to a lot of this fashionable dress, we have dress movements. So we have the dress reform movement and the women's rights dress reform movement really first, starting in like the 1840s. A lot of women's rights reformers are working alongside Haudenosaunee indigenous women, and Haudenosaunee women are wearing from a Western point of view, what to us looks like an overskirt over leggings. And the practicality of this is not lost on these white women who are working as women's rights reformers. And they adopt in the early 1850s and actually in February of 1851, they adopt this new costume of a shortened skirt over what will be known as bloomers. So bloomers are not an undergarment, they are an outer garment. They're trousers essentially for women that are quite billowy and they gather right at the ankle. So many dress reformers, women's rights activists are really lauding the practicality of the bloomer costume, the fact that it's not it doesn't involve yards of fabric draping and training and tracking dirt and horse droppings that are in the road into your home. These are very real health concerns, just beyond the limitations physically that these some of the more fashionable dress items can impose on women at this time. So women, male doctors, feminists, artists, athletes, health advocates, a lot of people are advocating for this mode of dress. Many women that are part of the westward expansion movement in the 1840s and thereafter adopt this mode of dress, and they don't want to go back. When you're traveling across a country, you really can't keep up these gendered roles. It's just impractical. It's all hands on deck, lest your family starve. So women moving west especially are adopting this bloomer costume. And for the early 1850s, a lot of people are saying, yeah, it looks kind of different, but I can't deny the practicality of it. But that quickly changes. So before 1830s, women, so this is a conversation about the difference between bloomers and drawers. So bloomers, again, are an outer garment. They're almost like trousers. They would have been worn over drawers, which you can think of as underwear. It is it's the closest garment to the lower half of a woman's body. They're usually open in the center. So if you are receiving a call from nature and you are completely dressed, you can simply excuse yourself behind a partition, a screen, or go into a different room, position yourself over a vessel and answer that call right then and there without getting undressed. Before the 1830s, women did not wear drawers. So if we look at the swing, this famous 18th century portrait, we think, oh, it's just a woman on a swing. What's so scandalous about this? But if you know this fact about gendered undergarments, that man in front of her hiding in the bushes, who is her secret lover, because her husband is pushing the swing in the background, he's getting quite a view. And that is absolutely what the artist implied, and why this Rococo painting was seen as really kind of vulgar and scandalous when it first came out. But not knowing that information, it's quite a, it's a romantic scene in a way. So I really just wanted to not only go through a little bit of the history of gendered underwear, but also make sure that it's clear that bloomers and drawers are two very different gendered clothing items in the 19th century for women. So we specifically start to see their incorporation again with the women's rights movement and some of these big name players like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Smith Miller. They all adopt the bloomer costume for, I'd say, a solid 10 years. However, I did note that there's a heck of a lot of ridicule that these women face from wearing it, so much so that it starts to invite a lot of criticism at their speeches. So they're starting to notice, like, most of the people that are here for my speech on women's rights are not here to listen to the importance of advocating for the adoption of women's rights. They are here to look at my bloomer costume and to tear it apart. So unfortunately, the bloomer costume kind of fails, and a lot of women's rights advocates and just previous supporters stop wearing it until about the 1890s, which we will get into. But the name bloomer itself comes from the magazine, The Lily, in which it was published, which was Amelia Bloomer's magazine. So it was actually Elizabeth Smith Miller, a friend of Amelia Bloomer, who wore the Bloomer costume in February of 1851, walking to Amelia Bloomer's house for a meeting, and she stopped traffic being seen in this costume. And then a month later, Amelia Bloomer published an article in the Lily about how practical it was, and the name just stuck, and it has stuck since then. So in the 1890s, we start to see a resurgence of bifurcated garments, excuse me, for women. And this was because of the bicycle craze. And Rochester, New York is actually the epicenter of the bicycle craze on a worldwide scale. We had over 74 bicycle manufacturers in the city at that time. We had all of the what they called side paths or bicycle paths established, connecting all of the neighborhoods around the city into the city. And Rochester was known as sort of like the bicycle center of the world. And because of that, a lot of women wanted to participate in bicycling. You no longer had to have the means or the time or the resources to get a carriage or a barouche or a buggy and travel. You could get on your bike by yourself, unattended, and travel tens of miles in one afternoon, all by yourself, all powered by your ambition and your legs. This changed the world. And Susan B. Anthony actually is quoted as saying, "The bicycle has done more for women's independence than we ever were able to accomplish." And this bicycle suit with knickerbockers, as they called it at that time, emerges. And we will be recreating our own bicycle costume for the exhibit this May, and it will be on right in our lobby. So we will have a very colorful and exciting bicycle costume on display, along with a bicycle on loan to us from Ontario County Historical Society from that period. Now, physicians, for a time, some physicians, I should say, warned that women who took part in bicycling, just the sheer amount of energy to maintain your balance alone was too much for the natural countenance of a woman to bear, and she would develop an overwrought, overexerted facial expression known as bicycle face. So not only were these like quack medical diagnoses invented to discourage women, they were often depicted as being masculine for bicycling, wearing these knickerbockers. They're smoking, and they are slowly taking over the world and displacing men. And this is disrupting the very bedrock of society. So this is very relatable for today. There are many politicians arguing that men and women are destroying the natural order of how men and women are supposed to be, and it's going to result in the breakdown of the bedrock of our society, that we need to turn back before it's too late. So this very heated, very venomous current political argument is nothing new. And they were talking about this in the 1890s because of a bicycle, if you can imagine. So women's dress reform, really the rational dress movement, kind of fails with that bloomer costume, but they succeed uh, in changing women's underwear. Excuse me. So women start to see options for them beyond fashionable corsets, really being the fairest good sense corset. So they replace the spring steel with cording or Coraline, this new featherweight boning, and women are still able to achieve that fashionable silhouette without the cost of their comfort and health. And they're able to partake in sports and bicycling and all sorts of activities wearing these non-fashionable soft corsets. And we were so lucky to have a Ferris Health corset come into our collection, and that will also be on display as part of this exhibit. Now, I'm realizing we're getting a little short on time because I ramble on, and I'm going to speed up a little bit this next section. So this exhibit and this presentation will also go into and explore how one's relationship with fashion and clothing and gender is directly affected with one's relationship to God. And we are going to look through that eyelet through the Quakers, the Shakers, and the Oneida community, and specifically the public universal friend. So the Shakers wore clothing that would diminish not diminish, eliminate levels or classes of society, but would diminish secondary sex characteristics of really the female body. So it would diminish the hips, the bust as well, in order to to create a state where people are not distracted by those features as they felt Western non-Shaker society operated, so to speak. We also have the Oneida community, which was an experimental utopian, some people may say sex community here in upstate New York. And women here really adopted the bloomers, and they even shorn their hair quite close. And the duties throughout the Oneida community were not based upon one's gender or one's biological sex. Really, everyone pitched in. They disbanded in the early 1880s, and they became the Oneida Silver Company. So if you have Oneida Community Silver in your household, as many people do, that comes originally from this society, this utopian society that folded in the 1880s. And we have an image of the Oneida Mansion. You can see both men and women milling about, and women are in this, for lack of a better word, bloomer costume. Now, Quakers, they have a very fascinating gendered fashion history. Most of them at the early 19th century subscribed to plain dress. So there's no decoration, there's no trims, there's no lace or ornamentation, but there's a very clear differentiation between men and women in Quaker plain dress. There are some Quakers that wore mainstream fashion, and those are known as gay Quakers. Now, Public Universal Friend is really seen as America's first non-binary preacher. So they were born Jemima Wilkinson as a Quaker. Their family participated in the Revolutionary War, so they were they were shunned by the Society of Friends. And Jemima became ill in 1776, and she lay down in her bed and reported that she died. And when they were revived, they said that God revealed to them revelations that Jemima was now in heaven, and they were in the body instead was a genderless spirit put on earth to proclaim the word of God. So not only did they have an express non-binary identity, which they would say, I am neither man, I am neither woman. You may refer to me as the friend or the public universal friend. They also took on elements of their dress in the sense that they wore clerical robes, which are really male-coded clerical robes. They did not wear a lady's Quaker cap. They wore a Quaker man's hat instead, and a Quaker man's neckcloth. And they lived the rest of their life into 1819, identifying and living and operating as a non-binary American. And when someone would challenge this identity or dead name them, as we call it nowadays, they would respond with Bible quotes. I am that I am, or thou sayest it. So, and this is a portrait of Public Universal Friend. This is in the Yates County Historical Center, and they are lucky enough to have the actual hat and cloak and the shoes of the Public Universal Friend. Now, one of our last subjects is cross-dressing as a way of performance in the 19th century. So we are specifically looking at this through both a gendered fashion component and a racial component. So there is a gentleman, a self-identifying male gentleman by the name of William Dorsey Swan. He is born into slavery in Maryland. By the age of 24, he is no longer enslaved. This is in the early 80s. He is working and operating in Washington, D.C. and organizing his self-identified drag balls. So what I mean by that is in these newspaper clippings, he himself is using the word drag or drag queen to self-identify. And it's the earliest known recorded use of that word in America, in America's history. And he is holding balls, drag balls, which are private parties that he's hosting in households where men who like to perform in drag are performing in these beautiful opulent gowns. William Dorsey Swan's brother made all of his silk and satin gowns. And these private parties, which are totally legal, are routinely raided by the police. The participants, the Black participants arrested and the white participants let go. All of the Black participants' names are published in the newspaper the next day and labeled as disordered or partaking in a disordered household, which is another way of saying a brothel. So this would result in them being fired, evicted from their housing, or just really establishing a terrible reputation. Simultaneously, what is happening is this great tradition of white female impersonators in minstrel shows. And they are selling out churches, selling out opera houses, selling out theaters in Geneva, Canandaigua, Phelps, Rochester, Batavia, all sorts of places, particularly a gentleman by the name of Bert Stanley, and even the son of the founder of, oh goodness, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name. Burton Stanley, that is, he is traveling around upstate New York as a female impersonator. He is a white gentleman, and he at first starts his career out in minstrel shows. So he is going into blackface, performing as a racial caricature of a Black woman or a woman of color, and people are loving it. He's selling out the house, and he's traveling, enjoying a very successful career. No one's getting arrested. None of these parties are being raided. So there's a very clear delineation of race that it has a very different reaction whether you are cross-dressing while white or cross-dressing while Black. Now, Burton Stanley goes on and leads the minstrels and begins a career performing as a white woman, performing opera arias, all the way to Canada and Maine, and he dies in the early 20th century. William Dorsey Swan is routinely arrested. He even petitions President Grover Cleveland, but the president denies this petition, and he stays in jail. When he comes out of jail, he's had enough and he does not perform in drag anymore. He lives with his brother until the early 1920s. He dies in 1925, and the town descends upon his house and burns it and all the beautiful dresses to the ground. So nothing in memory that we know exists today. The image on the right is of Mr. Brown, another female impersonator of color, performing what is known as a cake walk. which evolves into the barbering song that we know today. So these are some of the news clippings about the drag parties being raided. It was in a hell of iniquity. They're really muckraking these poor performers, unfortunately. Now these I'm sorry. So some of the community partnerships for this upcoming exhibit, because we do not possess everything within our museum collection, unfortunately. So we have been so greatly benefited by the participation of museums, libraries, and some private collectors, and of course, Ontario County Historical Society, who has lent us the bicycle and a little boy's Polonaise frock, which it blows all of the frocks we have in our collection out of the water. So I'm so excited to show you that. And Susan Green's amazing daguerreotype collection will also be on display. 19th century photograph is a great way to not only see what people looked like, but their fashions and the gendering of their fashions. So some of the mounts in the actual exhibit you'll see this Ferris health corset. We have swimming women who in their really masculine military coated riding habits. We have a dandy in the background here from the beginning of the century with his lace and his frills and his embroidered waistcoat. And then we have two frocks. I'm not going to tell you which one is for the boy and which one is for a girl, but they are differently gendered here on the right. I'd be interested to see who thinks who is the boy and who is the girl and why. So some of the final thoughts are rather how much of gender presentation is natural, how much is formed by society. Do we really make the clothes, or do the clothes make us? If what constitutes being a man and a woman is constantly changing, what part of that is even real in the first place? And then another thought is we hear young people, the Zoomers as they're often called, wearing androgynous clothing, but is it truly androgynous, or is it becoming more and more male coded? We see women wearing pants, we see women wearing hoodies, but I'm not seeing men wearing dresses or skirts in everyday life. I'm seeing that at highbrow events like the Met Gala or the Oscars or the Grammys. So that's an interesting component too. Why are we so comfortable embracing masculinity but not femininity? Why is masculinity a movement up in power, but men are not moving toward femininity to gain power the way women are moving toward masculinity to gain power? So thank you so much for partaking in this presentation. Becoming Gendered: Garment as Gender Artifact opens May 6th of this year at Genesee Country Village Museum, and I certainly hope to see you there.
All right. Thank you so much, Brandon, for that amazing talk. If you've got a few minutes, I'd like to open it up to questions. So we don't have that many yet, but it'll take a second for the stream to catch up with us. So if you have questions, please ask them in the chat while we still got Brandon here. I do have our first question is about the term bloomer. So when and or why did the term bloomer become associated with undergarments specifically?
That's a great question. And I think that happens really in the 1930s when the suit becomes feminized. We start to see women really taking on bifurcated garments as part of normal everyday dress. So when we start to see at that time period any sort of frilly, billowy, not quite full length undergarment for women, we start to refer to those as bloomers or even knickers. I see the word knicker being used in the 1930s to refer to underwear, when both bloomer and knickers or knickerbockers truly refer to an outer garment that would probably be worn over drawers and a pair of stockings.
Great, thank you. Next question. What did men and women wear at night?
So when they're sleeping, I presume, we're wearing bedclothes. So this is a time before we can just go to the thermostat and change it to good old 68 to 72.
Right.
This is a time when it costs a lot of money to heat rooms in your house, whether with coal or wood. So you're wearing clothes to go to bed. You're wearing maybe a sleeping cap to keep you warm and to protect your hair from the pillow and the pillow from the oil of your hair. You may wear several pairs of stockings to bed to keep your feet and your lower legs warm, as well as a long, uh, you could call them like a bed shirt. It's essentially, especially for men, it looks like a white man's 19th century shirt that's just longer. And you're going to wear that to bed. And women wear kind of like a full length or a half calf length version of that, where it's essentially a T with two triangles under the underarms, and you are wearing that to bed. You may even have the draperies around your bed to really lock in that heat around you as well.
All right. Well, thank you. What was the difference in men's and women's clothing for the lower and working classes?
Great question. So, I mentioned earlier that, whether you are working class or have an abundance of wealth, you still are very much adhering to those societal gendered, let's say, silhouettes for that time. It's probably just not of as fine of a material. So your shirt may still be of cotton or linen. It may just be coarse, and it may lack, carved mother of pearl buttons or fine embroidery. It may be homemade, and it may be your dad's shirt or your grandpa's shirt that has survived the ages and been mended over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
But we are still very much, whether you're working class or in a state of abject poverty, adhering to those societal silhouettes. So right now, for instance, if you are very, very, if you are on the edge of poverty, you're not probably going to wear something that is out of the ordinary from the silhouette of this time period. Still, you're going to look like you take place here, even if you don't have access to, silks or, a Patagonia or a North Face or what have you. Sure. And in the 19th century, it's just the same. It would just be of lesser quality, and you would probably wear it a lot more without variation.
Makes sense. Okay. I've got one last question from the chat. I think this will be our last question from the chat. Did fashion change with age? For instance, did anything change as a senior, especially with men?
That is a great question, and it especially comes. You can really see how fashion changes with age or doesn't change with age in 19th century photograph. So people, our self-image and the image we create for ourselves, the way we style our hair, it tends to crystallize in our mid to late 30s. And we adapt, we change with what's available. Like the style of shirt might not be available anymore 20 years from now, and I have to buy what would be considered a very modern contemporary style. But in the 19th century, it's the same. You can see older people in photographs where it's clearly from the 1860s based upon the technology of the photograph, but they're wearing something that's like mid 50s. So you can see, especially with men, the momentum of fashion, changing fashions in menswear slows down in general, and when you're older, it slows down even more. So I see daguerreotypes or tintypes of older men, maybe even with their families from like the 60s or the 70s, and they're very clearly wearing a jacket that's 10 years old while their young sons are in the latest fashion or attempting to approach the latest fashion. Women also in the 19th century tend to, especially if you're an older woman, that you get to a point where I think just like the sheer effort of keeping up with those very complex styles and wearing all the apparatus becomes a burden. And if you're old enough, you might just say, I'm just gonna stay where I am right now. So it's very often that you'll see, um, daguerreotypes again of family portraits in the 1880s where there's an older woman and she looks like she's out of the 1860s or has very clearly adapted an 1860s dress to try to look 80s. But it's probably only for that photograph, and she would go right back to what she was most comfortable in at home after that photograph was taken. I
That
mean,
makes
you
a
can
lot
see
of
moms nowadays wearing,
right.
their 90s mom hair still
Yeah.
in the 2020s.
Yeah. I
So that, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm pretty sure my dad still dresses the same as he dressed in the late '90s, early 2000s. So,
Oh, absolutely. My mom still has the half up, half down with the bang 90s hair to this day.
yeah,
And that,
yeah,
that was normal in the 19th century as well. Absolutely.
awesome. I know I said that was the last question. You have time for one more quick
Oh,
question.
absolutely. Lay it on
Okay,
me. Give them to me.
great. So you talked about women's undergarments, but not
Mhm.
men's. What about
Correct.
men's undergarments? What do we know about that?
So we do have what I wouldn't call them drawers. I'd
Mm.
probably call them like under trousers or under pantaloons for men. Um, Design wise, they look very similar to men's trousers, but they're made of a finer material because they have to go under the trousers. So you can't have a thick underwear material. They also usually use like a drawstring or one button rather than a series of buttons down the fly front. They may also have like a little ankle strap uh, that you can tighten it around your ankle. I will say, especially in the early 19th century, there were always something you could wear under your trousers or even breeches if you wanted to, but a lot of men use the bottom half of their shirt. So you can look at shirts in the early 19th century and think, gosh, why are they so long? This is halfway
uh,
to my knees and it's split up the sides, but that is a functional element where you can take the splits and bring the back to the front and the front to the back and gird your loin with the
hmm.
bottom of that shirt. Um, and you can still see some stains on the backs of some of the
Oh,
shirts in the collection because of the way they were used. So,
uh-huh.
I pity those poor laundresses or housewives who had
Yeah.
to clean those shirts.
Yeah. Wow. I can't imagine. Well, thank you so much, Brandon, for the
Absolutely, my
great talk.
pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. As a reminder, we've got one last of these virtual talks for this year, so make sure to check that out, and make sure that you check out the Genesee Country Village and Museum for the Becoming Gendered exhibit opening in May. Um,
Excellent.
but thank you all again, and have a good night, everyone.
Bye bye.